One of life's big questions, something that at some point all of us need to do business with, is what is our purpose? What is your purpose in life? Johan Hari, in his book Lost Connections, he talks about his friend Joe, who works in a paint shop. Every day it's the same thing. The customer walks in, he tells him to pick a color off the chart that he's got up. He puts a pigment of that color into the paint, and he's got a machine that shakes it vigorously to make sure that the consistency's right. He takes their money, says, "Thank you, sir," and then waits for the next customer. Every day it's the same thing. Take an order. Shake some paint. Say, "Thank you, sir." Wait. And again. And again. And on. And on. Now, on one level, he should be grateful he's got a job. Some might say that. Especially in these times, when life is so uncertain, to have some way of making a living, he should count himself lucky. Granted, the book was written in 2018, so that was before COVID was the thing, but even so, he should be glad he could make a living. But is he really? Is he making a living? I mean, sure, he's getting an income. Sure, he's able to meet his basic needs, but is he really living? Doing the same thing over and over again. Doing the same thing day in and day out. Every day Joe would leave work and think, I'm not really making a difference in anybody's life. And that same monotony every day was just soul destroying. Now, for many of us, work makes up a significant part of our lives, and it's something that the Bible has important things to say about. It's something that Genesis 1-3 has important things to say about. And we'll have time to think about that a bit more in a few weeks. We actually want to give that its own sermon to think about that in some detail. But today I want to take a step back, go a little bit more meta, and to think about something else that Joe's story highlights for us. Something more fundamental that applies to more than just our work. What is your purpose in life? What is our purpose? That, I think, is Johan's point in telling Joe's story. Joe's story, along with many, many others, shows us that a possible cause of anxiety and depression is disconnection from meaningful work. To use Joe's words, a feeling that I don't feel like I've made a difference in anybody's life. It's a feeling of aimlessness, of purposelessness. But again, while it applies to our work, and while our work is one place where I think it's acutely felt for many of us, it's something that's more fundamental that can be felt in all areas of life. It can be felt across the board. We want our lives to mean something. We want to feel valued. We want to matter. And what I'm hoping that we'll see from Genesis 1 is that we have the best reason in the world to believe that we do. That's what I'm hoping you'll take from our passage this morning. But before we can get there, we do have a few other questions to answer, a few other things to think about. So we'll be focusing in mainly on Genesis 1:26-28, just those few verses, looking together at the origin of humanity. And we'll do that by asking three questions. Where are we? What are we? And why are we? But before we get into any of that, let's read those few verses together. God said, "Let us make humanity in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the skies, and over the livestock, and over all the land, and over all the creatures creeping along the ground." And God created humanity in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the land and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the skies, and over every living thing creeping along the land." This is the word of the Lord. Now, let's think first about where are we? On one level, this might seem like a strange question to ask. Last week, we thought about the origin of everything, and Jason took us through Genesis 1, which presents for us the creation of the heavens and the earth. So on one level, where are we? Well, we're on the earth that God created. End of story, right? Well, I think it asks a further where question. Where are we on the earth? But where do we fit in? Where are we in relation to, or in the bigger picture of, the rest of God's creation in Genesis 1? So let's actually back up to verse 24. God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Now, what do you think the writer of Genesis is wanting to get across here? Well, just from sheer repetition, I think what he wants us to see is that these creatures were all created according to their kinds. But when we get to verse 26, when we get to the creation of humanity, there's a difference. Let us create humanity not according to their kind, but according to our kind. Let us create humanity in our image, in our likeness. Now, just what it means to be made in God's image is a big question, and we'll have a few things to say about that in a moment. But before we move on, I just want you to feel the weight of this. God, all of God's creation is good. At the end of each day, just about every day, God looks upon his creation and says, it's good. When he gets to the end of his creation, by the end of day 6, he looks upon all of it and in summary fashion says, it's very good. In its completed state, it is very good. Verse 31. But being made in God's image sets us apart from all of it. One writer puts it this way: humanity is the only item on the entire creation list that has a prototype. God himself. So what does this mean? What does it mean that we're made in God's image to reflect his likeness? We want to think next about what we are. So we've asked, where are we? Now we want to ask, what are we? Some have looked to what sets us apart from the rest of creation. A famous dead guy, John Calvin, he wrote, "It seems that we do not have a full definition of image if we do not see more plainly those faculties in which man excels, and in which he ought to be thought the reflection of God's glory." Some have pointed to our capacity for relationship with each other, but also relationship with God. Some have looked at our capacity for wisdom and rationality, and we've explored those and how they all fit together in a recent module, Faith Seeking Understanding, that we're actually still in the middle of, if you're listening to this in real time, but that you can find on our website, faithseekingunderstanding.co.za. I'll also leave links in the description below if you do want to dig deeper into this and to think more about what each of these might mean and how they fit together. But what it really comes down to, what being made in the image of God really comes down to, is being God's representatives. In the ancient Near East, it was very common for kings to set up images of themselves around their kingdom. It was a way of asserting their rule, to show everybody who lived in the various regions of their kingdom who was in charge. And the writer of Genesis seems to be playing off this idea that was very common in their day. As one writer puts it, like a statue reflects the presence and the power and authority of a king, so human beings reflect the glory of God. We'll have more to say on this in a minute, but it's worth pausing here just to make a couple of observations. The first is that we're all made in the image of God. Every single one of us. Look again at verse 27. God created humanity in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, if you're reading an ESV, you might have noticed a difference between what I read and what's in front of you. It really comes down to that word man. The Hebrew word Adam can mean man, but it most often is used to talk about men and women as a collective. It's talking about humanity rather than just men in particular, which is what's behind the NIV. The NIV's translation, which has mankind. We could make it even more inclusive and say humankind. So God created humanity in his image, which is like a summary statement of what he's going to go on to say in the next two lines. In the image of God, he created them, which is actually a singular pronoun in the Hebrew, which is why the ESV goes with him. But again, it's talking about humanity, the collective. And the collective is singular. A flock of sheep. The word flock is a singular word, but it's talking about the collective, which is a number of sheep. Same sort of things going on here. Humanity is made in the image of God, singular, but talking about the collective. And it's only in the third line that we break out into male and female. Male and female, which comprises the humanity that's made in God's image. Now, that might have felt really nerdy, and like I went into way too much detail, and if you didn't take all of that in, that's fine. But what I really want to get across is that all of humanity, male and female together, are made in the image of God. There's no male primacy in this verse. There's no idea that men are somehow more in the image of God than women. And when we link back to what being made in the image of God meant to the writer of Genesis, that humans are God's representatives, calling to mind royal imagery in the ancient Near East, the fact that this point is so carefully made is a big deal. For the other nations, it would only have been the king represented in these images. It would only have been the king who was the God's representative. In other words, only men. But the writer of Genesis is saying that no, men and women are made in God's image. Men and women reflect God's glory. And when we see just how inclusive Genesis is with being made in God's image, it isn't a big step to see how it might be inclusive in other ways. All of humanity is made in God's image. Male, female, single, married, young, old, black, white, colored, Indian, it doesn't matter. All of us bear the image of God. All of us share in the dignity and the worth and the privilege of being God's representatives, of being made in his image. So that's the first thing. We're all made in God's image. The second thing is that we're together made in God's image. Look again at verse 27. Whenever it says that we're made in God's image, it's talking about humanity as the collective. That isn't to say that you aren't individually made in God's image. Every single one of us is made in God's image. It's both. It's that we're collectively made in God's image and individually. But what that means, and what that is to say, is that we need each other. To fully embody being what it means to be made in God's image, we can't just go it alone. We need each other. So we thought about, where are we? We thought about, what are we? And as we come to the end of our time together today, I wanted to think about, why are we? That might seem like a strange way of putting it. Why are we? We usually say, why are we this? Or why are we that? I kind of just wanted to keep the pattern going. So why are we? Really what I want to do is to focus in on the question we started with. What is our purpose? What does Genesis 1 teach us about why we are here? Look with me in verse 28. God created humanity in his image, and God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, fill the land and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the skies, and over every living creature along the land, creeping along the land. We're God's representatives. We're royalty. And as God's kings and queens, we're called to rule. The question is, what on earth does that mean? We have governments for a reason. We can't all be in charge. If everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. And if nobody's in charge, that's anarchy, and anarchy doesn't work. So what on earth is going on here? Well, this language of being fruitful and multiplying, of filling and subduing, is a motif that actually flows all the way through the Old Testament. It's the same words that are given to Noah in Genesis 9. Later, God promises Abraham that he will bless him, that he'll make him very fruitful, and that he will greatly multiply his seed. He makes the same point to his descendants. So in Exodus 1, they're now an extended family, and they're in Egypt. And Exodus 1 is covered in fruitful and multiply sort of language. So look at Exodus 1 verse 7. The people of Israel were fruitful, and they increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. At least 4 times in that one sentence, we're told how they filled the land of Egypt. And I think we're meant to hear resonances of Genesis 1. That gives us a bit of an idea, but we're still actually only in the start of the story. And like I say, this is a theme that flows all the way through the Old Testament. We're not going to go into it in more detail now, but I think the point is made that the job given to humanity in Genesis 1 to 2 is to expand the borders of God's kingdom, to fill the world with his blessing, with God's blessing. So one writer puts it this way: we can speak of Genesis 1:28 as the first great commission, which is applied to humanity. The commission was to bless the earth, and part of the essence of this blessing was God's salvific presence. Our job of filling and subduing the world isn't a job of conquering or of setting up Christian nations. It isn't about legislating the Bible or about Bible bashing. It's about bringing God's good news of God's kingdom, which has come in its fullness in the person of Jesus Christ. And we're bringing that message, that good news, to as many people as possible in our words and in our actions. So where does this leave us? We've seen that we're set above the rest of God's creation as his image bearers, the pinnacle of his creation, and as his representatives. We've seen that comes with great privilege. It comes with great honor and dignity. It's something that we all participate in. That all of humanity is made in the image of God and reflects his glory in some way. Of course, we can reflect it more or less brightly. The better we embody what God is like, the more accurately we reflect his image. Not in the sense of trying to be God, but in the sense of living the way that he wants us to, in obedience to him and in right relationship with him. And this same logic can be applied to the other thing that we said, that we are together made in God's image, as a collective. It's an individual thing, but it's also a corporate thing. We need each other. And again, this is how this is most fully reflected in God's people as we live as citizens of his kingdom. And so, lastly, with great privilege comes great responsibility. And we saw that our commission as God's image bearers is to extend the abundance and the joy of his blessing over all of creation, which we do together by embodying his kingdom, and in so doing, spreading the good news about Jesus, his King, in both our words and our actions into the whole world.